The widowed grandma fed stray dogs alone until the lonely farmer brought her a ring made of rope. Imagine a 74-year-old woman, her hands calloused from life, feeding starving dogs in a forgotten Arizona town, while her own neighbors dismissed her as a madwoman. Martha Henderson didn't know that her solitary kindness was about to change not only her life, but also the heart of a man who watched her actions from afar, waiting for the right moment to approach her. What she didn't imagine was that this silent stranger harbored a secret that would transform her existence into a love story that would defy all social conventions in Prairie Springs. In the small town of Prairie Springs, Arizona, where the scorching sun beats down on the parched earth and dreams seem to wither like desert flowers, Martha Henderson walked every morning through the dusty streets carrying a bag of dog food. Her gray hair tied back in a simple bun, always wearing the same faded blue dress that had belonged to her late sister, she became a familiar but not necessarily respected figure among the residents. People whispered on street corners, pointing out this woman who wasted food on stray animals while they themselves barely made ends meet. Share this story to reach further, subscribe to the channel, share this video on WhatsApp, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll be very happy to read each comment. Now, let me tell you a story that will touch your heart in a way you never thought possible. Martha woke up every morning at 5, not because she needed to, but because the silence in the house became unbearable when the sun rose. The emptiness left by Harold, her husband who had died 3 years earlier, still echoed through the hallways of the small wooden house they had built together in the 1970s. She made coffee for one, ate toast for one, and cried tears that no one else was there to wipe away. The only thing that gave meaning to her mornings was knowing that out there, on the streets of Prairie Springs, there were creatures that depended on her to survive another day. The ritual always began the same way. Martha would open a can of cheap dog food, mix it with leftovers from her own meal, and place everything in a worn cloth bag. Her slow but determined steps first took her to the corner of Main Street, where 3 stray dogs patiently awaited her arrival. They recognized her from afar, wagging their tails with the gratitude she rarely received from humans. "Good morning, my darlings," she whispered in a voice filled with tenderness, as if speaking to grandchildren she never had. At every stop, Martha felt the weight of the judgmental gazes that followed her. Mrs. Eleanor from the grocery store shook her head disapprovingly from her shop window. Mayor Thompson commented to his friends at breakfast that that woman was losing her mind. Even the young pastor at the local church had obliquely suggested that she should channel her charity toward more noble causes. But Martha didn't care because she knew those animals had no one else in the world but her. During the coldest winter months, Martha would even use her own coat to warm an injured dog she found shivering behind the pharmacy. She spent half her modest widow's pension buying veterinary medicine while scrimping on her own needs. Her hands, scarred from decades of domestic work, now bore the scratches and bites of frightened animals who didn't understand that she only wanted to help. Even so, Martha never gave up, because she knew that giving them up would mean giving up the only thing that still connected her to the feeling of being needed. What Martha didn't know was that her acts of kindness weren't going unnoticed. Across the street, always at the same time, a silhouette observed her daily routine from the window of an abandoned house. James Mitchell, a 68-year-old retired farmer, had moved to Prairie Springs 6 months ago, but hadn't yet had the courage to introduce himself to the community. He watched Martha with a mixture of admiration and melancholy, recognizing in her a gentle soul who, like him, knew the weight of loneliness. Every night, Martha returned home with her bag empty, but her heart a little fuller. She sat on the porch, watching the sunset tint the Arizona sky with hues of orange and pink, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for finding purpose in the midst of her pain. Little did she know that her prayers were being heard not only by the heavens, but also by a man who would soon have the courage to step out of the shadows to share his loneliness with hers. James Mitchell had arrived in Prairie Springs one September morning, driving a faded blue Ford pickup truck loaded with only the essentials: a few clothes, yellowed photographs, and a chest pain that seemed incurable. He had lost his wife, Rebecca. The same year Martha was widowed, but unlike her, James chose to flee the memories, selling his Texas farm and seeking refuge in a town where no one knew his story. The house he rented was strategically located across the street from Martha's daily walk, and that was how he discovered he wasn't the only broken-hearted person in Prairie Springs. In the early days, James watched Martha with discreet curiosity, hidden behind the dusty curtains of his living room. He noticed how she walked with purpose, how her eyes sparkled when the dogs ran to her, how she spoke to them as if they were old friends. There was something in the gentleness of her gestures that reminded him of Rebecca, who also had a heart too generous for this world. James felt a pang of envy for this woman who had found a way to transform her pain into love, while he simply hid from her. As the weeks passed, James began to adjust his routine to match Martha's. He would wake early to make coffee and position himself at the window, as if to watch his favorite morning show. He watched her brave the cold October mornings, wearing only a thin sweater, how she struggled to reach the smaller dogs, how she wiped the tears from her eyes when she found an injured animal. Her every gesture awakened in James a growing desire to help, but also a paralyzing fear of putting himself at risk of caring again. One November morning, James witnessed a scene that would change everything. Martha stumbled as she stepped off the curb, spilling all her food onto the dusty ground. She remained there on her knees, trying to gather the bits of kibble mixed with the dirt, while the dogs surrounded her anxiously. James saw tears stream down her face, not only for the lost food, but for the frustration of not being able to help her four-legged friends. In that moment, he understood that watching from afar was no longer enough. Rebecca always said that shared grief weighs less, and perhaps it was time to test that theory. James spent the rest of that day pacing the house, rehearsing how he would approach Martha. He had been a farmer for 40 years, a man of few words and simple gestures, but he knew that some situations required more than silence. He thought of Rebecca, of how she smiled when he made small gestures of kindness, of how she believed that kindness begets kindness. Perhaps it was time to honor her memory, not just by mourning, but by living the values she held dear. That night, James made a decision that would change not only his life, but Martha's as well. He would introduce himself, offer help, share the burden of this lonely mission. Little did he know that this decision would lead him to discover that true love doesn't come just once in a lifetime, and that sometimes the best companions are those we find when we're no longer looking for them. The next morning, James woke with his heart pounding faster than usual. He'd spent the entire night contemplating how to approach Martha, changing his mind hourly about what to say or how to introduce himself. Finally, he decided on simplicity. He'd leave the house at her walk time and casually offer to help. He put on his best plaid shirt, combed his gray hair to the side, and for the first time in months looked in the mirror, expecting to see not just a grieving man, but someone who could still be of use to the world. Martha was at the third stop on her route when she noticed a tall, thin man approaching slowly. She recognized his face. She'd seen him a few times in town, always alone, always with that reserved air of someone carrying heavy secrets. When James stopped a few feet away, he removed his cowboy hat and said hoarsely, "Good morning, ma'am. I'm James Mitchell, your neighbor from the Blue House. I've noticed your kindness to these animals and was wondering if I could help in any way." Martha's heart raced, not with fear, but with surprise. It had been so long since someone had offered to help instead of judging. I'm Martha Henderson," she replied, nervously adjusting the scarf covering her hair. "You don't have to worry, Mr. Mitchell. I know it must seem strange, a woman my age chasing stray dogs." James shook his head, his blue eyes shining with a kindness she hadn't seen in years. "It doesn't seem strange at all, Mrs. Henderson. It seems the most right thing I've ever seen anyone do in this town." In that moment, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced since Harold was alive, the feeling of being understood without having to explain herself. James slowly bent down, his knees protesting his age, and began helping Martha distribute the food. He spoke softly to the dogs, using the same patient tone he'd used with the cattle on his old farm. "Easy, boy. There's food for everyone," he said to a brown mutt that growled suspiciously. Martha watched in fascination as the animals, usually wary of strangers, accepted James almost immediately. There was something about his energy that conveyed reassurance, as if he were one of those people born with the gift of soothing wounded creatures. For the next 20 minutes, they walked side by side through the streets of Prairie Springs, stopping at each spot where Martha usually left food. James carried the heavy bag, offered his arm when she needed to crouch, and made simple but comforting comments about each animal. "This one seems to be feeling better from his injured paw," he observed of a dog Martha had been treating for weeks. "And that dog over there is expecting puppies. She'll need special care soon." Martha was impressed by his knowledge of animals, but even more so by how effortlessly he integrated himself into her routine. As they finished their last stop, James pulled a small paper bag from his pocket. "I brought some homemade cookies," he said, almost shyly. "I thought after taking care of others, maybe you'd like to take care of yourself too." Martha felt her eyes fill with tears, not of sadness, but of a gratitude so deep it couldn't be put into words. It had been 3 years since anyone had cared if she was eating well, if she was tired, if she needed company. In that moment, she knew that James Mitchell wasn't just a helpful neighbor, but perhaps the answer to prayers she hadn't even known she'd prayed. In the following days, James began showing up promptly at 7 in the morning, always carrying something useful. An extra bag of food, a thermos of fresh water, or small medicines he discreetly purchased at the veterinary pharmacy in the neighboring town. Martha, who for 3 years had faced the challenges of caring for abandoned animals alone, now had a silent but effective partner. They developed a natural rapport, as if they were a dancing couple who learned each other's steps without needing words. James always walked on the side of the street, shielding Martha from the morning traffic, and she always saved the last biscuits from her bag to offer him at the end of the walk. At first, their conversations focused solely on the animals. James told stories of his days as a farmer, tending hundreds of head of cattle, and Martha shared the small victories and defeats of her daily mission. "That yellow dog has already had her puppies," she announced on a rainy December morning, her eyes shining with joy. "5 little ones, all healthy. I managed to convince the hardware store owner to let them stay in the back shed until they grow up." James smiled, noticing how Martha's face lit up when she spoke of her successes. It was the same expression Rebecca wore when she told him about the plants she managed to make flourish in her garden. As the weeks passed, the conversations naturally expanded beyond the animals. James told her about his Texas ranch, how he had raised Angus cattle for 40 years, and the satisfaction of seeing a sick animal recover under his care. Martha shared memories of her 50 years of marriage with Harold, how they were never able to have children, how she channeled all her maternal instincts into caring for those in need. "Maybe that's why I feel so connected to these animals," she confessed one cold afternoon as they watched an injured dog James had taken to the vet. "They need me the way I've always wanted to be needed by someone." James began to notice small details about Martha that touched him deeply. How she always kept an extra tissue in her purse to wipe the watery eyes of an elderly dog with conjunctivitis. How she whispered words of encouragement to the most frightened animals, using the same loving tone she would probably use with a child. How she saved on her own meals to buy more expensive medicine when one of her charges fell ill. There was a purity in her kindness that James hadn't seen in years, and it awakened feelings in him he thought he had buried along with Rebecca. On January morning, as a freezing gale swept through Prairie Springs, James arrived at Martha's house carrying 2 cups of hot coffee and an extra coat. "I thought maybe I'd cut the walk short today," he said, seeing how she shivered even inside. "I left extra food at all the stops last night. They'll be fine." Martha invited him inside for the first time, and James found himself in a house filled with happy memories. Photographs of Martha and Harold, smiling at different times in their lives, decorated the walls, and there was a soft scent of cinnamon and warmth that reminded him of what a home should be like. Sitting in the small kitchen, drinking coffee, and watching the storm through the window, James and Martha talked for hours about everything and nothing. He told her about the loneliness that drove him to leave Texas, about how he woke every morning not knowing why he should get out of bed. She talked about the sleepless nights, about how she sometimes talked to Harold's photographs as if he was still there. "Funny how 2 people can feel so alone in a city full of people," Martha observed, stirring sugar in her coffee. "Maybe," James replied, looking directly into her eyes, "we just needed to find the right person to share this loneliness with." The Prairie Springs winter was particularly harsh that year, with temperatures dropping to 15 degrees C, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, in the early morning hours. James and Martha adapted their routine, leaving later in the morning and building small, makeshift shelters for the dogs out of cardboard boxes and old blankets. During one of these frigid mornings, James noticed that Martha wasn't wearing gloves, and her hands were red and cracked from the cold. That afternoon, he went to the local department store and bought the softest pair of gloves he could find. But when he arrived at her house to deliver them, he discovered that Martha had gone to take an injured dog to the vet, using the money she had saved to buy medicine for her own arthritis. Martha's extreme generosity began to worry James. He noticed she was losing weight, her clothes were getting looser, and she sometimes shivered, not just from the cold, but from weakness. One night, he made a decision that would change everything between them. James took from an old drawer a piece of rope left over from his time working on the farm, a strong, resilient rope that had seen him through 1,000 difficult tasks. With his deft hands, he began braiding the rope into a circle, creating a simple yet meaningful ring. The rope ring wasn't pretty by conventional standards. It had no diamonds, didn't sparkle in the light, and was worthless on the market. But James knew its value lay in its intention, in the promise it represented. He worked on that ring for 3 nights straight, remembering Rebecca, asking for silent permission to move on, to open his heart to love again. She would understand. He whispered to the photograph of his wife on the bedside table. She always said that love doesn't diminish when shared, it multiplies. The next morning, James woke with a courage he hadn't felt in years. He put on his best clothes, combed his hair carefully, and tucked the rope ring into his shirt pocket close to his heart. When he met Martha on the corner of Main Street, he noticed she looked different too. There was a lightness in her step, a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. "Good morning, Martha," he said, and for the first time he didn't call her Mrs. Henderson. "Good morning, James," she replied, and something in the tone of her voice made his heart race. During the walk, James was quieter than usual, lost in thought about how to broach the topic burning in his heart. He watched Martha interact with the dogs, noticing how she radiated pure, unconditional love, and wondered if there was room in his heart for a different kind of love. When they finished their last stop, instead of saying goodbye as usual, James gently touched Martha's arm and said, "Could you give me a few minutes? There's something I need to talk to you about." They sat on a wooden bench in front of the church, the same place where Martha sometimes stopped to rest during her solitary walks. James took the rope ring from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. "Martha," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I know this may seem strange, and I know we've both experienced great loves, but in these months, walking by your side, caring for these animals together, I've rediscovered what it means to feel alive. You've taught me that there's still good in this world, that there's still reason to wake up every morning with hope in our hearts." Martha felt tears well up in her eyes. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of joy, so profound she thought her heart couldn't contain them. James held Martha's hands in his, feeling the rough texture of her aged skin, but also the warmth emanating from her soul. "This ring is not made of gold or silver," he continued, sliding the rope ring delicately onto her finger. "It is made of the same rope that helped me build fences, pull animals from the mud, tie bales of hay. It is made of honest labor, of the strength that comes from necessity, of the endurance that only time can give. Just like our love, Martha. It is not young, it is not perfect, but it is real and strong enough to last." Martha looked at the ring on her finger, so simple yet so meaningful, and knew she had never received a more precious gift in her entire life. "James," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I never imagined that at 74 I would discover that the heart can love twice in a lifetime. Harold was my first love, the love of my youth, full of dreams and promises. You are my second love, the love of my maturity, based on understanding, on partnership, on the knowledge that I am no longer alone in this world." She paused, looking into his blue eyes that shone with unshed tears. "I accept this ring. I accept this love. I accept this chance to be happy again, because you taught me that it's never too late to start over." The kiss they shared was tender, respectful, filled with a mature passion that needs no rush, because it knows it has time to grow. The few residents who passed through the square that morning witnessed something rare. Two hearts meeting not in the spring of life, but in autumn, when the leaves are at their most colorful and the fruits are sweetest. Mrs. Eleanor from the grocery store stopped sweeping the sidewalk and smiled for the first time in months. Mayor Thompson, walking to work, removed his hat in a sign of respect. Even the young pastor of the church, leaving morning mass, made the sign of the cross and murmured a prayer of gratitude. In the months that followed, James and Martha were married in a simple ceremony at the Prairie Springs Church, with the stray dogs as special guests waiting outside. Martha wore the blue dress that had belonged to her sister, but this time with a bouquet of wildflowers James picked in the field. He wore the same suit he had worn to his wedding to Rebecca, but with a renewed heart full of hope. The rope ring never left Martha's finger, even when James gave her a traditional wedding band. "They both have different meanings," she explained to anyone who asked. "One represents the love I chose, the other represents the love that chose me." They moved to a larger house on the outskirts of town, where they created a veritable sanctuary for abandoned animals. The yard was filled with colorful little houses, bowls of water and food, and the joyful sound of barking and meowing filled the air. Martha finally had the large family she'd always dreamed of, and James found a purpose that gave new meaning to his days. They grew old together, caring for each other and their creatures, proving that true love has no age limit or end date. Years later, when Martha was 82 and James was 76, they still walked hand in hand through the streets of Prairie Springs, now accompanied by a small crowd of adopted dogs who followed them like a happy family. The rope ring was still on Martha's finger, a little more weathered by time, but still strong and resilient. "You know what I learned from you?" she said to James one golden afternoon as they watched an Arizona sunset. "That sometimes God takes a long time to answer our prayers because He's preparing a better answer than the one we asked for. I prayed for companionship, and He gave me love. I prayed for help, and He gave me a lifelong companion." 5 years after their wedding, Martha and James had become living legends in Prairie Springs. Their home on the outskirts of town was known as the Haven of the Forgotten, a place where injured animals, abandoned elderly people, and lonely children found shelter and unconditional love. What began as a simple morning walk to feed stray dogs had become a true lifelong mission that touched hearts throughout the region. Martha, now 79, still wore the rope ring James had given her, but now it was accompanied by a collection of small gifts that neighborhood children made for her. Beaded bracelets, colorful drawings, dried flowers they picked in the fields. James, at 73, had discovered a talent he didn't know he possessed: storytelling. Every afternoon, he would sit on the porch of his house with an unlikely audience of children, dogs, cats, and even a few adults who happened to pass by just to listen to his tales of country life, animal adventures, and life lessons he'd learned over the years. "Do you know why I fell in love with Grandma Martha?" he'd ask the children, who would always shout excitedly, "Tell it again, Grandpa James." And he'd repeat, his eyes shining, the story of the rope ring and how two lonely hearts found each other through kindness. During this time, Martha developed a special program she called Adopt a Grandparent. She noticed that many of the children visiting the shelter came from families where their grandparents had passed away or lived far away. So she began connecting these children with lonely seniors in the community, creating intergenerational bonds that benefited both parties. "Love is like a seed," she explained to interested families. "The more you plant, the more you reap. These children need wisdom, and our seniors need youthful energy. It's a perfect exchange." The program grew so much that it now serves 3 neighboring towns. Martha and James's work did not go unnoticed by the local press. Journalist Sarah Chen of the regional newspaper Arizona Daily News wrote in a special feature on the couple who had transformed a small town through love and compassion. "When I asked Martha what her secret to happiness was," Sarah wrote, "she showed me the rope ring and said, 'Love doesn't have to be expensive to be valuable. Sometimes the best things in life are made with our hands, our hearts, and the time we choose to dedicate to someone.' And in that moment, I knew I was in the presence of people who had cracked the code to true wealth." The story resonated beyond Arizona. Letters from admirers arrived from all over the country, people wanting to know the story of the couple who had proven that love has no age. One of these letters particularly touched Martha's heart. It was from a 68-year-old widow from Portland, Oregon, who wrote, "Dear Martha, I read your story in the newspaper and cried with emotion. I lost my husband 2 years ago and thought my life was over, but you taught me that perhaps it is just the beginning of a new phase. I started feeding stray cats in my neighborhood, and yesterday a neighbor offered to help me. Who knows, maybe I'm at the beginning of my own love story." Martha kept all the letters in a special shoebox, and sometimes when she felt tired or discouraged, she would reread them to remember the impact her story had made. "See, James," she would say, showing a particularly touching letter. "That morning when you first approached me, you weren't just offering help. You were planting a seed that would grow far beyond anything we could have imagined. Today, couples are meeting, animals are being saved, and children are being loved because we both decided not to give up on kindness." James hugged her, feeling the same gratitude in his chest that he felt every morning waking up next to the woman who had brought color back into his life. Did this story touch your heart? Then share this message of hope with others who need to believe that it's never too late to start over. Subscribe to the channel to receive more inspiring stories like this. Leave a comment telling your own story of love or overcoming. And keep watching our videos to discover that life always has wonderful surprises in store for those who don't give up on their dreams. Thank you for being part of this emotional journey and for believing that true love blossoms without an age limit.